Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Christina Vessels, and I am here with my colleague, Ashley Allione. We only have an hour to cover a lot of great material today, so I'm going to cut right to the chase. Nobody saw coming this global pandemic, but we've seen nonprofits adapt to the present circumstances just like everybody else is adapting, or at least doing their best to adapt from working from home. So you're not only working from home, but we are fundraising from home. In the next hour, we're going to cover a primer on state's charitable solicitation laws and what you should consider as you plan for all types of online and virtual fundraising activities. Two quick housekeeping items. We're going to be monitoring questions as they come in, but we expect to answer all questions at the end of the presentation. This is going to be a very full hour. And secondly, for those of you who are watching this presentation today for CLE credit, we'll be announcing the CLE code at about the halfway point. So before further ado, let's jump in. And before getting into the specifics of state's charitable solicitation laws, I do think it's helpful to lay a bit of framework and take a step back to consider why these rules exist. Fundamentally, state's charitable solicitation laws exist to protect the public. In a way, they're sort of akin to consumer protection statutes. And by regulating nonprofits and the third parties acting on their behalf whenever donations are asked for, states basically set a bar for engaging in these fundraising activities. They sort of set the minimum standards for how to engage in truthful, transparent, and all around well-rounded activities that enable the public to understand the effect of their donations. So just keep in mind that everything we're sort of talking about today is geared towards telling the public, how they can support your organization and basically how those monies raised will be used. So with that, I'm turning it over to Ashley.
So as Christina mentioned, many of the state's laws regulate charitable solicitation. You can see from the map on the right that approximately 40 U.S. jurisdictions regulate the solicitation of contributions. And what this means is that if you're soliciting funds nationwide or in a particular state, albeit in person, online, you're making fundraising calls, you may have an obligation to register to solicit in the state, as well as other obligations relating to solicitation in the state. When we talk about charitable solicitation laws generally, and you're wondering if it applies to your organization, the definition of solicit and solicitation is very broad. So it's generally what's listed in these three bullet points here, which means a direct or indirect request for a contribution, to be money or property, on the representation that the contribution will be used for charitable purposes. And as an example of how broad the state's laws are, in California, the definition of solicitation includes any appeal that is made for charitable purposes, and in New York, it includes to directly or indirectly make a request for a contribution, whether expressed or implied through any media. I mentioned those two states specifically because each has a very active state attorney general and charity enforcement bureaus, and they're watching who's soliciting in the state, and just as examples of how broad the definitions really are. So if you're thinking, is my organization making a solicitation and do these laws apply? The answer is probably yes. And one note is that formal grant requests are often solicitations. There are some states, though, that do accept grant requests. Maryland's one of those states. So that's one thing to double check if you're applying for grants in a state, whether or not grant requests are covered. So registration is required for soliciting residents of the state by letter of the law and typically required prior to soliciting. So state statutes are often phrased something like, every charitable organization which intends to solicit in the state must register prior to solicitation. And we say usually prior or typically prior because there's a few states where this differs. For example, in California, registration is triggered upon the receipt of funds or property, so that's one state where it's different. Registration is also prerequisite for various activities that are listed here, one of which is benefiting from a charitable sales promotion, which Christina will go over in a little, but ultimately your registration impacts whether the company that you're contracting with can register. So being registered is one reason set so that you don't miss out on these corporate partnership opportunities. And as we've mentioned, there's a few exemptions, but ultimately your 501c3 status doesn't guarantee an exemption. In most cases, you're likely not exempt, but you would just take a look at those laws when you're getting ready to fundraise. And as we're getting close to an election, I want to mention that typically political groups are exempt because they're regulated under a separate set of laws, generally state campaign finance laws. But when we say political groups, it's a reference to political committees or PACs, not 501c4 social welfare organizations that may be engaging in political activity. New Jersey is one state that recently has made it very clear that its state's charitable solicitation laws apply to 501c4 soliciting in the state. This past summer, it issued a press release regarding a voluntary compliance program, notifying these organizations that they are required to be registered. They're giving a grace period until October 1st, 2020, so exactly 1 week from today, to voluntarily comply with the state's laws without incurring a penalty. And the press release notes that penalties range from $10,000 to up to $20,000 for each violation. So while we don't know what's going to happen after October 1st, I think it's fair to say that the state is going to be taking a close look at unregistered C4s that are soliciting in the state. For anyone that's interested in that press release, we're happy to provide it to you. One final note on New Jersey is they actually recently changed their law in 2019, and they now require all charitable organizations to file a copy of your unredacted Schedule B in the state, regardless of whether or not it's due at the IRS. So that will impact 501c4s this year. At a minimum, where should your nonprofit register? So at a minimum, in your state of incorporation or the state of your primary operations, if those are not the same. This is where your activities are taking place, where you're fundraising. This is the baseline of where you should be registered. Then look to where your organization is conducting physical solicitations. This is an easier analysis because you know where you're sending direct mail. You have a mailing address, you have an area code. Your organization should register where it's required in any state where physical solicitation is taking place. And the big question is, and what we're talking about today relates to registration related to online solicitations. So we'll get into the analysis, but one consideration will depend on whether your online solicitation is active activity versus passive activity. Are you actively reaching out and targeting donors via online solicitation, or do you have a website where you don't know who's donating? It's available nationwide, but it is a more passive solicitation. So with COVID, everything is happening online. I'm assuming each of your organizations is virtually making appeals for donations online, looking for ways to engage with donors. Organizations are sending emails and they're pushing donors to their website. We're getting asked, does my organization need to be registered nationwide because it has a website? Or if I send fundraising emails nationally, does my organization need to be registered? It's a good question, and really the answer is everyone's favorite answer, which is that it depends. But with that being said, I'm going to quickly run through the analysis, and that will provide you with the framework to think about whether your organization should be registered based on your online activity. As you may have suspected, unfortunately, many state statutes don't address online solicitation specifically, and the closest guidance that we have is something called the Charleston Principles. These principles were issued in 2001 by the National Association of State Charity Officials, and I only mention the date because they haven't been updated since 2001. But ultimately, the goal is to provide some type of template or standard that organizations and state charity regulators could use to determine whether registration was required for online solicitation. And it's for this very reason organizations were looking to understand where they should register based on their online activity. Ultimately, these are non-binding guidelines. They're voluntary principles. So aside from the 3 states listed here, Colorado, Mississippi, and Tennessee, they haven't been incorporated into state law. But with that being said, they do provide a helpful framework for organizations to consider whether they should be registered based on their online activity. And it really comes down to 2 main questions. Is your organization domiciled in the state, or is it domiciled outside of the state? This slide shows the portion of the Charleston principles that relates to registration requirements as they apply to internet solicitations. So if you're domiciled in the state, you're in your home state. And Charleston principles say that if you use the internet to solicit in your state, registration is required. They don't parse through the type of your activity, what you're doing online, whether it's online, active versus passive. And if you're following the rule of thumb and your organization's already registered in its state of incorporation and principal place of business, you're covered. But you should think, if I'm in my home state, I'm using the internet, you're required to register in the state. If your organization's not domiciled in the state, here's where the analysis comes in. Because for the most part, I assume most of your organizations are looking for where outside of my home state do I need to be registered. So registration is required if your non-internet activities alone would be sufficient to require registration, and you solicit contributions through an interactive website. This basically means that your website has a feature where you can make a contribution. The principals use the example of entering credit card information. So if you have the ability to donate online through your website, it looks to whether A, you're specifically targeting persons in the state, this is B1 to I, or 2, whether you receive contributions from the state on a repeated and ongoing or a substantial basis. The principles define targeting persons in the state to mean an express or implied reference on your website to the state or an affirmative appeal to state residents when you know or reasonably should know those people are located in the state. If your website is not interactive, a donor can't donate on it, then you're going to look at your other activity. What are you doing offline to drive people to this website to promote your organization? You look there, and then you're going back up to these 2 factors. Okay, I'm offline, I'm driving people to my website, they can't donate, but am I specifically targeting a state? And 2, where are my donations coming from? Are they coming on a repeated and ongoing basis or a substantial basis? Many websites aren't specifically targeting residents. I would say that's pretty rare. But with that being said, I did see a website the other day that had a 24-hour appeal for a donation called The Name of the City Gives. So there, arguably, that would be an express appeal on a website to residents of that state. But for the most part, you likely have a website, you're providing information about your organization, you may have a donate button, and you aren't necessarily targeting people. Anyone can come to navigate to this website. So here you're looking at this 2-part analysis. Where are my donations coming from? Are they coming on a repeated and ongoing basis from a certain state, or are they substantial? And so as an example, perhaps you're a New York organization, you have 20 donations from Mississippi residents. You're not registered in Mississippi, and you're wondering, okay, now do I need to register? 20 people have donated. The Charleston principles direct regulators to define repeated and ongoing in terms of the number of contributors and substantial in terms of dollar amount. The goal was to set some kind of clear framework that organizations could follow so you could understand when registration would be required. And the principles suggested that repeated and ongoing may mean 100 online donations, and substantial could mean 25,000 in online donations from state residents in a year. That would be in the aggregate. So the states that did adopt the Charleston principles, those listed here, they did follow the guidance. They set numerical thresholds that you can see, each of which seems to consider $25,000 in online contributions to be considered receiving substantial contribution from the state. But you can also see that the range for repeated and ongoing varies. So aside from these states, again, the principles are voluntary. They haven't been widely adopted, but ultimately something your organization can look to as a guideline are to see, look, am I receiving repeated and ongoing or substantial contributions? So back to my Mississippi example, you received 20 donations from residents of Mississippi online through your website. They've contributed, I'm adding this in now, under $25,000. We're going to look at Mississippi. You have an argument, no, registration is not required at this time. But as it's important to remember, in every other state, there's no set threshold. So technically, yes, you are soliciting. Whether or not you are required to register, you're going to use this framework and do this analysis. And one way to keep track of that is by tracking your donors. This gives you the argument, it arms you to do the analysis. Where are your major donors coming from? How many donations are coming from each state? And now that you have this information, you're set and equipped to do the analysis and to be armed essentially as defense. Do you need to register in the state? So again, with COVID-19 and remote fundraising, email is a hot topic, and organizations are actively sending fundraising appeals and emails nationwide. I personally get them every day. So email is a little bit different, but in the end, it comes down to the same analysis. So here, it's active solicitation. So we're going back to this active versus passive online analysis. The website was passive activity, and you most likely weren't targeting residents. The Charleston principles say that an entity that solicits via email into a state is treated the same as one that solicits via telephone or direct mail if the soliciting party knew or reasonably should have known that the recipient was a resident and physically located in that state. So it may be that your organization has a mailing list and it knows physical addresses along with email, so it reasonably should know the state residents that it's targeting when it sends a nationwide email blast. But also people move. Your organization may not have that information, and it may not know when it sends a nationwide email blast who it's targeting. So to go back to our opening question, I'm sending a fundraising email nationwide. Do I need to register nationwide? If you don't know who you're targeting and you aren't making a specific appeal targeted at state residents, you're going to do that same two-part analysis and track, am I receiving donations on a repeated and ongoing basis or a substantial basis through the emails that you are sending? Again, with COVID, people are online. They're online all day. They're on their phones all day. As a reminder, an appeal to donate on social media is a type of online solicitation. The Charleston principles, again, haven't been updated since 2001, and state statutes don't address social media solicitation. But arguably here, again, this is an interactive website. You can make a donation, and assuming you aren't targeting residents of a specific state, you're going to look at where are your donations coming from, how much are your donations for. Consider any specific platform rules. And one final note that we're getting on social media, although this isn't particular to social media, we're being asked about fundraising on GoFundMe. Organizations are looking for creative ways to fundraise. GoFundMe is one of those ways. And this has come up a lot recently. The analysis for GoFundMe is the same analysis that I just talked about for a website. It's a passive website. You have a donate feature. As long as you aren't specifically targeting state residents, you're going to look to the two-prong test. Are you receiving repeated and ongoing contributions through GoFundMe, or are you receiving substantial contributions? So why is this important? Aside from the fact that it's a state law, lack of current registration can result in lack of corporate partnership opportunities. We've been told by organizations their registrations are delinquent and they've missed out because the corporate company won't partner with them. But with that being said, there are other considerations you may want to take into account for registration: your size and reputation, the nature of your activities, and compliance. There's a cost-benefit analysis you might want to engage in. And finally, be creative. Organizations are starting to move their fundraisers and galas to virtual events. These are some emails I received from an organization that hosted a virtual gala, and they did a really great job at marketing and touting the appeal of staying home. You don't have to miss out on the fun. You can see that they provide ways to host a watch party, encourage tagging on Instagram and Facebook. They offer to have someone from the organization Zoom in to greet you if you were alone. Dress up, don't dress up, do it at your own convenience. They sent wine, Grubhub cards, and ultimately this event was incredibly successful. And I think the takeaway here is that it's working and virtual fundraising is effective, so use all of the resources that you can. One additional consideration is that about half the states that require charities to register require the same charities to make disclosures. These disclosures are not the IRS disclosure regarding deductibility of contributions. These are separate disclosures that should be included on written solicitations. We get asked a lot about where these disclosures should go. They should be readily available to donors. Place it where a donor can see it, near your Donate Now button on your donation page, or often companies will also, nonprofits, put them in a footer so that it's accessible from multiple pages.
Okay. So before we sort of transition over to the next topic, we had a couple of questions come in related to solicitations, and I think it makes sense to address those now. And both of the questions really related to particulars of whether or not all activity or all entities are exempt. For example, if donations received are of a small amount, is registration still required? And the other question touched on if a school is fundraising and sending development mailings to its alumni, would registration be required there? These aren't really specific to online fundraising, but I think it's important to sort of take a step back. And at the very beginning, we were talking about charitable organizations that include not only 501c3 charities, but also social welfare groups and educational institutions. But yes, you should look to see if states' laws exempt certain entities or certain activities. So we often see exemptions when organizations solicit less than a certain amount, but that threshold really varies from state to state. In some states, organizations that solicit less than $25,000 are exempt. In other states, the threshold is as low as $5,000. And more complicated still is that sometimes you actually have to affirmatively apply for those exemptions. Likewise, schools often are exempt from soliciting from their alumni networks, but it really should be something that you kind of review on a state-by-state basis to see if, in fact, a particular entity or a particular type of fundraising activity is exempt from state's laws. So I think at this point, before we transition over to cause-related marketing, I'll announce the CLE code at this point, which appropriately enough is going to be fundraising. So just keep that in the back of your mind if you are watching today's presentation for CLE credit. All right, so Ashley laid the groundwork for related to what a nonprofit itself needs to consider for its own solicitation activities. But let's shift gears here to when a third party wants to get involved. What we're talking about now falls broadly under this umbrella topic of cause-related marketing. Basically, these are all sorts of activations where there's some limited benefit to the companies, such as, a halo effect and letting the company's, followers or, loyal consumers know that they're supportive of an organization. But the primary focus is for the benefit to the charity. So you're raising awareness not only of the charity's mission, but you're also raising money either from the company itself or from the public, I should way. All right, and as I mentioned at the outset, these rules really are oriented towards protecting the public. The rules themselves might be codified, such as in the FTC Act's prohibition on deceptive marketing practices or state's charitable solicitation laws. But there's also a bunch of non-binding guidance that organizations should look to when basically drafting any sort of solicitation materials. In addition, maybe you want to say that your charity is accredited by a particular charity rating organization. By and large, those organizations will require you to provide certain information to donors about your solicitation activities. But either way, keep in mind that the ultimate goal really is that you want to inform the public about the material terms related to any solicitation or other fundraising activities. If you do those things and meet the standards, for example, the BBB's Wise Giving Alliance standards for charity accountability, you'll be able to, receive those accreditations and let the public know that you've been reviewed in that way. So with the global pandemic, people are staying home, and retail activations, or rather in-store retail activations, have largely been put on hold, we've seen. But e-commerce shows no signs of slowing down. These online campaigns involve the same considerations that a traditional in-store charitable sales promotion would involve. But what really are they? So a charitable sales promotion is any advertisement in which a third party, usually a for-profit entity, advertises that the purchase of a good or the use of a service will benefit a charity. And really, here we say benefit a charity, but note that what we're talking about are, quote, charitable organizations as defined by state's charitable solicitation laws. So those could also include 501c4 organizations. And these charitable sales promotions, even though these are among the most regulated of the fundraising structures that we're going to talk about today, they're still among the most popular. There's really three main compliance areas that you need to consider for these. First are the contracts that are engaged in between the entities. These often require state-specific provisions. Second, you should evaluate where the promotion is going to take place and how the CCV will advertise the campaign. And third, consider the marketing materials for these campaigns. So the marketing materials and the disclosures required, really that's going to be, I think, the crux of getting right any charitable sales promotion. So I had jumped ahead of myself a little bit, and I was talking about, the global pandemic and people staying home. But yes, e-commerce is showing no signs of slowing down, even though traditional in-store charitable sales promotions have really been put on ice for the time being. But the considerations for an online charitable sales promotion are largely the same as those for traditional CCV campaigns. You want to understand who is donating, whether that's the actual platform conducting the campaign or some other third party. What is the public being asked to do? And most importantly here, how will the campaign be advertised? This last point is really where the analysis of in-store versus online campaigns varies slightly, because this really leads to the question of registration. If what we're saying is that a charitable sales promotion is the advertisement that the purchase of a good or the use of a service will benefit a charitable organization, you really want to consider where is the advertising taking place. And fortunately, even for a nationwide promotion, charities only have to register for a particular promotion in 5 states, and the commercial co-venturer would only need to register in 7 states, and that's if you've determined that the promotion will be applicable nationwide. When it comes to the online activations, though, this is where you sort of go back to those Charleston principles and you consider where is sort of the start of this advertising campaign? Where is the company that's going to be disseminating the advertising materials domiciled? If the company is domiciled in a state that has a CCV registration requirement, then we would suggest, yes, you would register your promotion in that state. Beyond that, you start to get into the questions of looking into the types of activities. For example, if there's an interactive website and specific targeting, is the company including a reference to an online campaign in a catalog that it mails to state residents? In the email context, do you have reason to know where the email recipient is located? For example, maybe you have their shipping address linked to an email address based on a previous purchase. By looking at these things, you can sort of take a holistic view of, or rather I should say a practical view of where registration might be required. But I do think it's worth reiterating that states' charitable solicitation laws do not specifically exempt online promotion. So Ashley mentioned the 3 states that had specifically adopted the Charleston principles or some part of them. Again, that was Colorado, Mississippi, and Tennessee. But what about the remaining states, the 40-some states that have these charitable solicitation laws, but don't necessarily have codified the Charleston principle in those rules? That's where you're sort of taking this combination of considering the non-binding guidance issued by Charleston principles and practical considerations like the scope of your campaign, the size of your organization, and name recognition. So once you've determined that registration is required, as I mentioned, there's registration obligations in 5 states for the charity and up to 7 states for the commercial co-venturer. Fortunately, with the pandemic, we know that getting wet signatures from folks is really challenging. I have been, shocked to learn how many people, myself included, don't have a printer at home and have to sort of scramble to find ways to print and scan documents. The good news, though, is that at least for the charity, all 5 states where a charity might need to register for a campaign have some sort of online or web-based notification process. In fact, Connecticut recently moved to an online filing system, so I think they were the last state where, potentially you might have been mailing in a copy of your contract, but now, fortunately, the promotion notices and such can be filed online. And again, so the 5 states that we're talking about for charities, I just saw a question come in on this, are Arkansas, Connecticut, New Hampshire, New Jersey, and Utah. And so if your charity determines that registration is required, many other states are going to require certain details in your contract, but those would be the 5 states where the nonprofit would need to submit their forms. For the company, the 7 states where filings may be required aren't quite as simple to submit online. Not all of the states have been prompted by COVID to move online, but states by and large are being more flexible in allowing e-signatures or DocuSigned. And so by and large, they're willing to work with your organization to get filings in, but it's certainly not uniform. And I think one thing to keep in mind your efforts in a charitable sales promotion, as they say, it takes two to tango. Your nonprofit organization might be filing in states, but you also want to understand where the commercial co-venture is going to file. You want to have parity and understand where each is going to be submitting documentation. And this becomes particularly important because if your organization has been or is registered to solicit contributions, as it likely should be to engage in this sort of promotion, then when it comes time to submit your annual charitable solicitation registration renewals, you may have to disclose the CCV in more than just the 5 states where the charity needed to file or the 7 states where the commercial co-venture needed to file. So you want to really have a uniform approach with your corporate partners. And so before moving on, I'm going to highlight sort of one thing that really gets people in a bunch, but it's this fourth prong here, fourth bullet here, is that usually the pre-promotion notices are required somewhere between 10 to 15 days prior to the campaign start. You all are on mute, but I feel like I have just heard a collective gasp because most of us get some version of an email that says something like, promotion live tomorrow, you get it at 9:30 p.m. on a Sunday night, and if you're really lucky, it has a little red arrow next to it so that you know this is moving forward, and the best you can do is basically try to make some last-minute tweaks to bring the promotion as close to compliant as you can. So even though states are mostly being flexible about the mechanics of filing, that is, some are allowing docu-signatures as opposed to ink signatures, the timing requirements for these filings has not changed. And in fact, I think with the rise of increased charitable sales promotions online, I think state regulators are seeing more and more filings come through, which is good. Compliance is better late than never, but we are seeing states like Connecticut and Hawaii and sometimes South Carolina issue stern reminders about the advanced filing requirements. So we haven't actually seen too many instances where late filing fees have been assessed, but it's good to keep that in mind, that to the extent you can, just note that there are early filing deadlines. I've seen that there's a couple of questions that have come in related to UBIT, and we're actually going to get to those towards the end of the promotion. And then there's one more question about the 5 and 7 states. I'll just say it one more time. The 5 states that require charities to register for a CCV promotion nationwide are Arkansas, Connecticut, New Hampshire, New Jersey, and Utah. For the commercial co-venture, you are looking at Alabama, California, unless otherwise exempt, Hawaii, Illinois is there's an asterisk on that, and we just don't have time to get into the particulars there today, Massachusetts, Mississippi, and South Carolina. So I've said it a couple times now at this point, but it's just worth reiterating that CCV status is triggered by advertising a campaign. This is, I don't think the Washington Post is a commercial co-venture. They're simply reporting the news here. I am not at all saying that the Washington Post would be subject to registration and filing obligations here. But I think this is a really interesting clip because it highlights how these campaigns can go big, or at least be big enough to garner the attention to be considered news. So this is just a fun reminder of why it's important to dot your I's and cross your T's. We're all working remote. We're working, via email, via phone. Everything's moving at a million miles a minute. But it is helpful to have systems in place and to know what compliance obligations are involved with these types of promotions, so that when you do get that Sunday night 9:30 p.m. email with a red flag, you're better equipped to move forward. And so far, really, we've been talking about the behind-the-scenes compliance issues, but in many respects, the advertisements for a campaign are the most important piece to get right, or is the most important piece to get right. The public should know what the material terms of the campaign are. How does the campaign work? What is the prospective consumer being asked to do? And most importantly, what is the effect of their purchase? State laws set a baseline of disclosure requirements that need to be included, but by and large, we're looking at these sort of 4 to 5 points. And the New York Attorney General back in, it was about 10 years ago, issued guidelines on best practices for CCV campaigns. And the guidance there has sort of become industry practice. You want to know who is making the contribution, who is receiving the contribution, based on what consumer purchase, how much from that purchase will benefit the charity, and in addition to how long the promotion will be active, what minimum guaranteed donations exist, what maximum cap is there on the promotion, and are there any limits or restrictions. In the e-commerce context, for example, at checkout, you have to include a particular code in order to trigger the donation from the charity. I think most of the disclosure points that we just talked about are easy to digest. Yes, you know the name of the store that's going to be making the donation. You know when the campaign will start and end. But the amount to be donated per action tends to give rise to the most issues. Companies often want to say things like all proceeds or all profits will be donated. This is really problematic because it doesn't give the consumer any real sense of the effect of their contribution. So when it comes to this, if you really can't get past the all proceeds or net revenue language, we suggest including a baseline like we see here, where you say at least X% of the price will be donated. And one final word on advertisements for these campaigns is that you want to be sure to, as a nonprofit, exercise your right to review the ads featuring your name so that you don't inadvertently restrict funds to a limited purpose. We see this happen a lot in the context of natural disasters. And again, nobody saw this global pandemic coming, but you want to be sure that you're not limiting the donations received from a particular campaign to a limited purpose. Maybe that is your intention, but make sure you review marketing materials to ensure that you're not inadvertently designating or restricting funds. So free action campaigns aren't a term, or isn't a term, that you'll find in states' charitable solicitation laws, but these are almost always online activations. And the premise here is that unlike a charitable sales promotion where the public is asked to purchase a good, we have a free action here. The call to action is based on some activity that involves consumer effort, but not consumer funds. By and large, you want to treat these the same way that you would treat commercial co-venture arrangements. Having a contract in place and making proper disclosures is really the best rule of thumb. These campaigns, though, do exist in a bit of a gray space because they're not clearly within the definition of charitable sales promotion under most states' laws. But it's a good idea to talk to counsel because some states like Alabama, Massachusetts, and Mississippi have definitions that are slightly broader than the norm, such that they might potentially capture free activities like making a video and posting it on social media. Shifting gears away from campaigns where the public is asked to buy or do something in order to trigger another to donate to a charity. Sometimes charities and companies want to keep things simple with a statement that, company X supports nonprofit Y. Here, there are no strings attached, and the company simply just wants to make a straight donation to the charity. What's really crucial for these types of arrangements is not only having a contract in place so that you know how your charity's name and marks are going to be used, but be sure to review the marketing materials for language that might suggest that the purchase or the company will, or rather that the purchase of a product will benefit your organization, because that would put you back into CCV territory. Instead, here, you're seeing lots of, proud supporter or proud sponsor language where there is no suggestion that the product itself leads to a benefit to the charity. Rather, we're saying that the company just broadly supports the charitable organization. Another type of classic example fundraising is a customer donation program. Usually you would see these at the cash register, where you're asked if you want to sort of make a donation tip to the charity. Would you like to round up your purchase, or would you like to add $1? In light of COVID-19, the real difference here is that checkout is online rather than in person. But arguably, this is actually favorable for charities and for charitable solicitation compliance purposes, because you have a bigger platform on which to explain your charitable organization's mission and give the prospective consumer more information on your charitable organization. So really, you're at the final page, if a company offers to do a customer donation program for your benefit, you're looking to make sure that there's sort of no implication that the company is retaining a portion of the donation. 100% of the donation should go to charity, and you should make sure to provide a description of your charitable organization and your mission and where to learn more about your organization at the point of sale. A quick word on Raffles, and I think I can sum it up in 2 words. Be careful. Raffles are illegal gambling unless state and maybe local law expressly allows them. They are sort of by letter of law considered illegal gambling because they offer participants the chance to win a prize after submitting consideration, and usually that's money, for the chance to win that prize. So unless a state or local law specifically allows your 501c3 organization to conduct a raffle in that state, you need to be very careful. And when it comes to doing these online, the variety and specificity of state and local laws that apply to raffles effectively make running a national online raffle impossible. There are states like DC where you can only submit your raffle payment in cash. There are just tons of restrictions out there on how to advertise them. So if you are going to be conducting a raffle, we often suggest setting up geo-blockers for how people access the raffle online, or even setting it up behind a password-protected site. Again, we don't have time to get into the specifics here, but if you are encountering a situation where your nonprofit doesn't meet the eligibility requirements to conduct a raffle in a particular jurisdiction, one option that you can consider is restructuring the promotion so that it meets the requirements of a sweepstakes. And often You do that by eliminating the donation requirement. So, a donation would not be required to enter the sweepstakes. Again, we really kind of can't get into the weeds here on this, but the key takeaway for you all is that just know that an online national raffle really won't be possible, at least to be in full compliance with all 50 states' rules. So we're going to close today's presentation with everyone's least or maybe most favorite subject, but a piece to keep in mind all the same, tax rules. The Internal Revenue Code gives preferred tax status to charities. So as long as a charity's income is earned in ways related to its tax-exempt mission, that charity will not pay income taxes on the amount earned. However, money received for purposes unrelated to an organization's charitable mission may be subject to tax. That is our dear friend, unrelated business income tax, or UBIT. UBIT can arise in situations where a charity provides, quote, advertising for a corporate sponsor. So what does the Internal Revenue Code mean by advertising? Really, this is any message that promotes a trade, business, or product. I hope a little bell is sort of going off in everybody's mind, and you're thinking, hold on, that brings us back to charitable sales promotions and the CCVs that conduct them. That's exactly right. So although charities are benefiting from charitable sales promotions, which talk about, or rather advertise to the public that a particular product, should be purchased over a competitor's project because it'll benefit the charity. Benefiting from the charity, being the beneficiary of that doesn't necessarily mean that you should go out and promote it, even though there may be a significant urge to do so. Because if a charity promotes a commercial co-venture's charitable sales promotion, you can see how it's very possible for that to come across as promoting a product, and you're encouraging the public to buy a particular business's product, which could be considered advertising under the IRS's rules. So under the UBIT rules, advertising includes statements that are qualitative or comparative. So, the best of X, or, competitor shoemaker Y has better shoes than competitor shoemaker Z, buy the Y shoes because, not only are they better, but they also support our charitable organization. Likewise, comparing products or endorsing a particular product, and even linking to the sales page of your CCV's campaign can trigger advertising considerations. So just be really careful in a lot of contracts, especially if corporate entities are the ones taking a first pass at the contracts or CCV agreements. They may have stipulations in there that ask your organization to promote the campaign, and you'll just want to be, cognizant of it so that you can consider whether or not you are willing to engage in those activities because of the potential tax consequences. So just to be clear, organizations are absolutely free to advertise. UBIT isn't illegal. It's not improper. Of course, everything in moderation. But as sort of just a global statement, you're absolutely free to engage in advertising. Just know that, doing so could have tax consequences for you. But let's say that your charitable organization prefers to stick away from potential statements that might trigger UBIT. What can you do instead? Generally, factually neutral statements are okay. So you are always welcome to say, thank you, corporate sponsor, for your support of our charity. We really appreciate everything that you've done for us.
And in those cases, you are able to use the corporate sponsor's name and logo, and you can, link to their homepage. Just be sure that you are not bringing it back, to the actual page that advertises the purchase of a product will benefit your charitable organization. So, we've moved really quickly through this today, but if you're going to sort of walk away with your team and talk about how you're going to successfully execute your cause marketing campaigns, first and foremost, have a contract in place. This applies not only to CCV campaigns, but it covers the free action campaigns, the customer donation program arrangements, and even to a more limited extent, statements of general corporate support. The contract is sort of your best insurance to make sure that you know how your name and your brand are being used by corporate sponsors, but it's also an underlying requirement under state laws that the corporate sponsors need to have your consent to use your name and marks. So for a whole host of reasons, leave time to execute a proper contract. As we said, notices are due 10 to 15 days prior for CCV campaigns if you determine that registration from your online campaign is actually necessary. And really, we highlighted this again and again, but confirm that the disclosures that your corporate sponsors are issuing for these campaigns, make sure that they satisfy state law requirements. That I think is, it's the most public-facing portion of your campaign, and it's arguably the most important to get right, because it's what will often prompt a state regulator to scratch the surface and dig a little deeper, is if disclosures made in marketing materials aren't proper. So with that, we have a couple of minutes. I think let's see here, switching screens. Sorry, I'm having a bit of trouble accessing the questions, actually. All right, well, so we're having a bit of trouble accessing the questions here, but to the extent that we have folks, names and email addresses, we'd be happy to field, questions in response to this presentation and any of the topics that we talked about. We know we really breezed through a lot of high-level topics, or a lot of topics at a high level. And if you're interested in hearing more about any of the topics that we covered today and you'd like a deeper dive on any of them, we'd love to hear from you and hear how we can sort of present to meet your needs and answer any questions you may have on our next segment. So I look forward to answering questions that have come in during the presentation. I want to thank Ashley for her all-star job laying down the basics of charitable solicitation laws and the basic requirements for nonprofits to consider with their online fundraising. And I look forward to hearing from you all and seeing you during our next webinar. Thank you so much.